I just think as a general rule, you have a goal here of preventing crime, right? Preventing criminals from accessing the system, from identity theft, from money laundering, all of these things, and trying to make the processes as efficient as possible. That's good for the financial institution. It's good for government,
Yeah.
right? Because the longer people take to identify it, then those criminals get away, right? So efficiency is a good thing for both sides. It's just striking the right balance and having, as lower percentage of an error rate, if you will, as a general rule. And so I think AI has a lot of promise. I think there's just a lot of sort of learning, regulatory learning, and sort of testing and explainability for it. But I think it has a lot of promise. There's also risks.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is Maria Vullo, CEO of Vullo Advisory Services. Maria, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Ankur.
Could you maybe just give our audience a better perspective into what you do today and then how you got to where you are?
Oh, sure. So I run a regulatory consulting firm. I'm a lawyer. I spent many years in private practice at a large law firm doing business litigation and regulatory work. And most relevant to, I think, our discussion today is I served as Superintendent of Financial Services for the state of New York, where I was the head regulator for banks, insurance companies, and non-bank financial institutions in the state of New York.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria, for that. And I think this is such a hot topic because AI in our personal lives, you can kind of have a little bit more liberty in terms of how it's used, where it's used, although there's a lot around data privacy and such. But when you talk about using this for some of the most sensitive areas that affect our financial lives in regulated spaces like finance and insurance, the bar gets insanely high, right? And I think the challenge is that this technology is it's constantly changing. It's getting better. It's getting more complex over time. And so when you're trying to then introduce regulation to keep people safe, I imagine that's a very, very hard task. So maybe a hard one to start with, but the question I think is really around how do you regulate something that is A, hard to understand day one, and B, is constantly changing in a month in, month out?
Well, I think, there's a couple of things here. Is what is the use that's going to be put for the AI? So in my mind, right, what does it mean to regulate AI? Like people are talking about it. It's like regulate AI for what use? What's the purpose for which it's being used? So if you're saying, okay, well, AI is going to be used, by a financial institution, which is regulated. Okay, let's take a bank. What is it going to use it for? Oh, it's going to use it for anti-money laundering. Okay, so there are laws and regulations about that. And if you're going to use AI, well, then there are actually existing regulations and guidance and processes that I think can pretty well adapt to AI. Maybe they need to be tweaked. So I think we really have to break it down as to what the use case is, as opposed to trying to tackle this kind of, well, let's regulate this thing. We have to think about what it's going to be used for, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's more about regulating the nature of work, and that has there's like existing regulation for that you draw upon and such. I think AI is yet just another tool to go and solve for it, right? And so it's like, how is it being used? That context
becomes really, really important.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because also, there may be businesses are using AI for a whole bunch of functions that might not, you know, have any kind of, you would say, public concern, right? They may be using it for their internal processes in different ways. Obviously, if it starts touching on things that have a public concern, like data privacy or other things, or obviously customer records, or again, anti-money laundering, then you wind up saying, okay, so what is this being used for? But it's like so many other things with technology. And there was a time that we didn't have the internet, right? There was a
Yeah.
time that there weren't emails. Right? I mean, I had a bank when I did my cybersecurity regulation, and they were like, "Do I have to comply? We don't use the internet for our banking." They were a small little bank. I'm like,
Right.
"Well, and you don't have to worry about it." Right? So there's, it really depends upon what it's being used for. If it's touching on any of the things that government, through its laws and regulations, has concerns about.
With anything net new like this, how do you think about regulation? So, like, what I mean by that is, and I think Europe, generally speaking, and I don't want to make complete generalizations, but they tend to regulate more quickly. They tend to be harder on the regulation when they come out. I think on the other end, like, for example, the Chinese are a little bit lighter in some of the regulations. I think that nature is changing, but they want to let technology flourish a bit more. And the US might be somewhere in between, right? And that's like maybe more historically speaking, like that's been kind of the norm. But we tend to wait to see what regulation makes sense, because like we can't regulate something if we don't understand it or know it. And so like maybe we take cues from the Europeans, but like we're not necessarily going at the full extent in these cases. And I think the balances of like how much do you not get in the way of trends that are going to be net beneficial, but like you want to understand where the risks are and then regulate for those risks, not regulate as a blanket statement. So I'm curious, like from your experience as regulator and now advising, how do you draw that line? How do you start to regulate something like this? And maybe an associated question here is, are we as Americans getting it more right or wrong in light of what others around the world are looking at?
Yeah, I mean, great. It's really a great subject because, it is true that Europe tends to be ahead of the game on so many things. I mean, GDPR is a good example on sort of data privacy, and it's stronger. And I can't remember, but it's over 5 years, right, that
Yep.
GDPR came out. And we still don't have the federal, data privacy. But also, the United States is just different in the sense that we have a federalist system. We have the federal government, and then we have all the states. So since the United States Congress has not seen it to be able to come together on a sort of general United States privacy law, to use that example, then we have states that have, California taking the lead on privacy, right? So the same thing with AI, you see Europe, and I don't know that one is better than the other. I just think that we as a country in the United States are just different, and so are they from us. No one is better than the other. It's just different. On privacy, there is a much stronger feeling in Europe than here in the United States. And I've seen that, and I was on panels when I was particularly in the insurance field when I was superintendent, and you could see the very strong difference with European countries on that.
And then in your roles with New York State, how have you gone about like when and how you introduce regulation? Because I imagine that there is a lot of understanding the technology that is that you're regulating, or understanding the work and how it's being affected, but then trying to get different perspectives, right? That perspectives gathering becomes really critical, because if you don't hear all the people that are for or against certain types of regulations, you really never know where to draw the line.
Yeah, I know it's a great. So, I mean, I'll use the cybersecurity regulation that I did in New York as an example, because when I came into the role in 2016, everybody was talking about cybersecurity. There had been huge number of hacking events, right? And there was no, and there still is no federal
Mm,
overall thing. And people were talking about it. We need this, we need that on cybersecurity. And I just, took everybody together and said, we're going to do something about it. And so what do? Is you bring in the most intelligent people that you could find. You do a notice and comment period. You take people who know the technical aspects and everything else. And I did the Part 500 regulation in New York. And, I did it in a way that was strong, but not prescriptive, so that it could sort of, you know, have the test of time. In other words, if you were to say AI, let's use, switch back to AI, right? If you were to do a regulation on it and then say, well, you can do this, this, and that, and very specific about it, well, the technology is going to get ahead of that regulation.
Yeah.
Well, what you need is principles and requirements that are going to protect what you're trying to protect. And so that's, again, how regulators, I think, mostly try to do things.
Mhm.
And there are also ways that you use guidance, where you give guidance, general principles, core principles, and things like that. But you have to also just take input for people. And that is a time consuming process,
Yep.
to do it right. But you have to take that time to do it right.
With banks and carriers, maybe lack of clarity on regulation that may come out in the near future, is that a blocker for them in adopting new technology, or do you find that they operate with good first principles on their own, and then if new regulation comes online, then usually they get a window of opportunity to go in and get their processes in order. So I'm just curious, how much of that is a blocker to innovation and progress and adoption versus it's not a big factor?
It's a great question, because, obviously it depends on what the it is, right?
Mhm.
But I think for regulated institutions, banks, insurance companies, or whatever it is, any kind of regulated institution, I think rules of the road are actually really important to them. Now, they don't want rules of the road that are too onerous and that don't adapt to their particular businesses, right? And so, and I will say, like, when I did the Part 504 transaction monitoring regulation, there were some that were like, oh, we have to do that. There were others that were like very appreciative,
Mhm.
because it was actually rules of the road. And compliance people love that, by the way. They love to know this is what we have to do. And then they feel that if we do this, we will be in
Yeah.
compliance. And so there is a comfort to that. Now, obviously, you have to strike the right balance between creating the rules and not restricting, innovation or other things. But you could always modify the rules. There's always a time lag. So it's not perfect. It's an imperfect system, but
Yeah.
it's the best we have, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely agreed.
Yeah.
So maybe switching gears here, what about the use of technology and software to handle things like anti-money laundering, and fraud, and even just doing like regulatory compliance filings that have to happen, right? There's more use of software and AI to enable some of this work that would have been very hard to do using manual effort. Where have you seen some of the adoption, during your time working with some of these technologies?
I mean, this has been an evolution, right? I mean, once upon a time, not so long ago, everything was manual, right? All of that was manual, and that's incredibly time consuming, right? And, people make mistakes too, right? And so, the development of anti-money laundering models, right?
Yep.
There has been, and there were the basic kind of rules-based models, and then they became, more complicated than the sort of simple rules-based model. And there was a whole debate on whether rules-based is actually a model or not. And you had compared to, say, an algorithmic model, right? And now we have AI that is straining people's thought processes a little bit about it, because of the machine learning aspect of it, and sort of creating maybe more difficulties in being able to test it. But everything is probably testable. But so I just think, as a general rule, you have a goal here of preventing crime, right? Preventing criminals from accessing the system, from identity theft, from money laundering, all of these things, and trying to make the processes as efficient as possible. That's good for the financial institution. It's good for government,
Yeah.
right? Because the longer people take to identify it, then those criminals get away, right? So efficiency is a good thing for both sides. It's just striking the right balance and having as lower percentage of an error rate, if you will,
Yeah.
as a general rule. And so I think AI has a lot of promise. I think there's just a lot of sort of learning, regulatory learning, and sort of testing and explainability for it. But I think it has a lot of promise. There's also risks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I used to work in anti-money laundering around 2017, 2018. And I think
Ooh,
during that era, people were turning more to like unsupervised learning. So in form of machine learning, finding patterns and a lot of data that otherwise would be invisible to the human eye. So like traditionally, for example, you would look at like, okay, what transactions are near that 10,000 mark, maybe coming
right.
from a risky source and maybe going through risky counterparties to get to a destination, and there's some level of frequency that's abnormal for that nature of the business. But again, you're hand engineering rules based on human expertise. And then I think there was this kind of shift to, okay, well, if you could do that, but then couple that with algorithms that can look at all of this data all at once and figure out like what are the truly abnormal patterns that bad actors are turning to. Because the problem is the bad actors keep changing what they do, right? So they'll do some bad stuff. You'll realize that they're doing some bad stuff. You then design rules to go solve for the bad stuff, but they're off to the next bit and they're designing more ways to get around the rules that you just created. And so it's this constant cat and mouse game. And this is
Totally.
where AI is like more real time adaptive and trying to identify that.
Yeah, and you
And
constantly have
yeah,
the FinCEN advisories that start giving you additional kind of, a look out for this type of,
yeah,
criminal
yeah,
activity, right? They constantly would, and so then the compliance people have to sort of go back and you have to program the model for these new types of, sequences or things like that. Or you look and the customer changes because the customer's income level changes, and then you have to, and like I said, there are error rates in all of that,
yeah.
and it's imperfect. And so the question is, but I think and I confess that some of it is even hard for me to understand, right? It's like, how exactly does this AI, generative AI, work?
Mhm.
And how do I know that this machine, which is not the human brain, right? It's using data, but how do I know that it can actually get it right such that it can detect a criminal sort of sequence of events,
That's right.
if you will, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that, I don't know, tested against something that I would recognize maybe as this sort of prior sequence of events that would be something that would be more comfortable, and I think this is how the regulators would probably think about it and be more comfortable, or even, frankly, the financial institutions, because they're worried about doing something themselves and allowing something to go through. They don't want to get caught with a bad actor.
That's exactly right. I think it's tricky because I think it's certainly easier to understand human crafted rules around like how to catch money laundering, because you could go and understand, walk yourself through the set of rules and how they were applied and what got triggered and what didn't. But I think what we've seen, at least in that era and now to today, is that machine learning AI is better at doing some of that work around fraud detection and AML. Certainly should benefit from human expertise, but it's able to do it at a scale, at a pace, at a level of like the amount of data crunching that could be done simultaneously. But then you have to introduce observability to it or explainability to it, which is, can you have the AI, or can you find ways to make it possible for the AI to explain what's happening, so you kind of work through what was and what was checked for and what wasn't, right? Because otherwise you don't even know like if the AI is getting worse at what it's doing or better at what it's doing, right? But I think combination of explainability plus some maybe audit function where you take a small sample, audit them as you would do in the
Sure.
older way, right? Like maybe more human centric way. You could go and see, is the AI truly better? And if it is, then you continue to invest it in more. If it's not, then you're able to find ways of identifying like
Sure.
what information, what context did he use that got it to be more confused. But I think that's a good like A/B test in some ways to go and see, is the AI better, adding value, doing this better than a human could do it? Because both have error rates. The question is, does your error rate come down by offloading human work to then AI?
Well, and also, what is the significance of the error rate, right? It's like, errors at what level, is it catching, more serious things?
Mhm.
But also, the sort of conceptually, what you were just saying about AI actually exists even with There are other kind of algorithmic AML models, right? And it's, there's outfits. They can be with accounting firms, or they could be with other types of companies, these advisory companies that do model validations of those things. Right. And and the regulators require it sometimes annually, depending on the size. So there has to be some type of a accepted type of validation of this. And again, I'm using terms that are in regulatory materials.
Right.
It's it's just the validation that it's basically working for its intended purpose.
Yeah.
Right. And so apply that to this new type of technology. Because again, when the other models came about, people had questions. Oh, is it working? How did it really? Compared to the individual just kind of following, maybe online the customer's transactions, or even on pieces of paper. And there's a lot of human error. So, yeah. So that's also what people have to recognize. Humans make mistakes. I've seen it, in AML, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
sometimes intentionally.
intentionally. Okay.
Well, and I think this is an important part where, I feel, now it depends on the data, right? So, and it depends on the purpose. But there are cases, and I've had it. I mean, I did enforcement actions when I was superintendent, and you would have in the anti-money laundering area people that would sort of shut off the machine, right? Or do things, not file the suspicious activity report,
Yep.
not, intentional actions by humans because they knew that there was a problem transaction or a problem customer or something. Now, machines don't, they may make mistakes, but a machine doesn't have the human intentionality, doesn't
Yeah.
have a criminal mind, right? So now, of course, a human can turn off the machine, so we'd have to figure that out. But it is something to bear in mind, so the automated processes could become maybe more biased when you're dealing with maybe credit scores and that kind of stuff, or other kind of biased data. But for anti-money laundering, it could actually be beneficial in some ways, in the example that I just gave, that prevents that intentional conduct from occurring.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think that's right. I think that the types of errors that humans do, and they're not even errors. Sometimes they're just might be bad actor behavior. That's gonna be very different than the types of errors and biases that AI will have, right? So it's kind of interesting to see, like, it's not mapping one to one, but generally, if the impact is better with AI, then I think there's more inclination to go and adopt it, right? And I think testing for that is really critical. I do think though that people have a higher bar for AI than for human work. So what I mean by that is you might realistically have a 3% error rate, let's say on a certain workflow that happens from humans. And then if you turn it over to AI, let's just say the AI is able to have that error rate. So it has a 1.5% error rate. But it may be that the 1.5% error rate, maybe because it gets quantified for the first time in ways that human error wasn't getting quantified, it gives companies pause, right? Even though you've shaved half the error from 3% to 1.5%, it's still too high because we need AI to be more perfect than that. And I think autonomous driving is a great example. There are a lot of deaths that happen because of human error in driving, right? They get distracted, they're texting, whatever it is. There is an argument that over time, AI and self-driving becomes better than the average human at driving. So basically, you would see fewer deaths, fewer accidents on the road, but even one accident from self-driving cars is one too many, right? And so like the bar that we have set ourselves up for AI being accepted for use in certain areas is materially higher than the same acceptance rate or criteria that we would have for people. So I'm curious sort of how you think about that as, because it is hard. Like, there are a lot of things to consider there.
I mean, it's interesting. And I think, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, is that, financial institutions are sometimes very hesitant to do something new. And certainly AI falls within that category. But sometimes it's, if the new thing is going to create a record of something, then that gives them extreme pause from a regulatory and enforcement standpoint. And so what you're describing there is, well, I'm going to have a computer. Again, it's not a computer, I get it, but it's going to be
Yeah.
a machine, right? And it's going to track this thing. And
Yeah.
at the end, that machine is going to say X% of these transactions are in some error category.
Yep.
And then my regulator is going to come in at exam time, and they're going to ask, what did the machine say? You got to show me what the machine said. Oh, it said 12%. And the regulator is going to say, that's too high of an error rate, because it is. That is too high of an error rate for, for like, say, a filtering system, like an unpack filtering system. That would be a very high error rate, because filtering systems have those, right? And so that might be, because sometimes it's like when somebody says, I have this great new product that's actually going to really help to determine whether or not your employees are doing anything funny. Well, do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to know. Because what if I find out, then what do I have to do? Then I have a problem. I got to figure that out. Right? Do I have to tell my regulator? Do I have to turn them in? Do I have to fire them? What do I have to do? Maybe it's better not to know. I mean, I hate to say this, but there is that sometimes, risk of it may be a little bit too easy that I have to sort of turn it over, and the human element is more malleable.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. Like once you start measuring something, it has its own order of consequences, especially around regulation, right? So it's
Sure.
like before it wasn't being measured, so you never had any level of precision. You didn't know what the error rates were from humans. And then all of a sudden, as you introduce more software is like ever observant, right? We can track everything. Part of the tracking is to improve that way that work gets done. But if the discovery is that, hey, the work that was getting done by the people that were in those roles wasn't being done that well, and then like AI is improving it, that's a great soundbite for a startup to say, hey, look, we're reducing your error rate from Y% to Z. But basically, that might be visibility, like shining a light on something that customer doesn't want, right? Like, and I think these are really important things when you think about like the fear of regulation, the fear of capturing data, the fear of like the consequences that those beget. These are becoming really important threads that I think companies are thinking through right now.
Yeah, and the fear of an enforcement action, quite honestly. And again, these sort of OFAC filtering systems sort of brought this on, because those systems are sort of automated processes, right? And the fuzzy logic where, name changes and everything like that, but they have to be programmed for sort of like that fuzzy logic of name changes. And then, but they have an error rate. And then it's like we come in and you look at what the error rate is, and then a regulator will say that's too high, you got to lower it, which then creates more alerts that have to be reviewed by the institution, right? And more false positives, quite honestly.
Yeah.
But it requires a lot more work. So, that, and again, if something is automated, it does create that risk because of the output that is sort of more readily available.
Well, switching gears here a little bit, there was
Sure.
this big rise of agentic AI startups that are trying to do that, like maybe a lot of the work that a single person would do. Like, I'll give you an example, trying to create an agentic AI for a compliance analyst. So these businesses end up basically doing units of work, they're delivering outcomes. They go into an organization, say, we will do this KYC workflow and deliver the reports that a compliance analyst or KYC analyst would normally go through. And I think the tricky thing is like, if that AI, the company that's providing this like service, this outcome to the bank, makes errors, right? Where does that liability lie? Does it lie on the software vendor that has basically, in some ways, is selling the units of work? Or does the liability lie with the financial institution that should be, in the business of vetting, hiring, holding the startup or software provider accountable? And what's the existing frame for that today?
So I guess it would depend on what the report that you're talking about that's being generated is being used for. So if the report has errors in it, and the errors are then used in something that is a regulatory requirement of some kind, and then the regulator is troubled by whatever that is, the financial institution vis-a-vis the regulator, the regulator could impose an enforcement action, right? It could impose lots of different things, including financial penalties
Mhm.
against the financial institution. Now, the third, the AI company is not itself regulated. It's a third party vendor, right? Of the financial institution. And then there may be a contract where the financial institution says, look, if you do something wrong, then, we're passing on that liability to you.
Right.
But I could say that in all of my sort of consent orders with financial institutions, I had a provision that said you can't, have somebody else pay for this fine.
Interesting. Okay.
Regulators
Yeah.
do that often to say, because regulators are very focused on making sure that the financial institution takes seriously its obligation because they're the one that has the legal obligation. I mean, a lot of this is it's the whole fintech world in lots of areas with like the bank partnerships. I
Yep.
mean, the Synapse situation, for
Mhm.
example,
Yep.
right? I mean, Synapse files for bankruptcy. Who's responsible for all, it's like the bank had all those deposits,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the way the regulatory system works. And that's why the process for fintechs and startups and what have you to be able to sell to financial institutions is so long and laborious
Right.
because they have concerns about this and you have to go through a long process because they know that they're on the hook if something is wrong.
Right. Right. And I think that's a great response and helps explain to startups or selling into big banks and carriers, for example, why the processes take long as they do. Right. And why
Totally.
you have to go through so many hoops and hurdles is like that administrative red tape is there because there was regulation. These institutions are regulated entities and they know what the consequences are of running afoul of that. And so I think that's a byproduct of just the nature of the business that
Yeah.
company's in, right? At the end
I
of the
mean,
day.
it's a lot of what I do in the fintech lab is that's what I talk to a lot of the
Yeah.
startups about is to sort of understand that regulatory environment. It's not personal. It's the environment in which, regulated institutions live. And so the process takes a while. Now, I will say that there is a piece of this though, that, on cybersecurity in particular, that if the AI company, the vendor, if you're going to get data from the regulated institution and then there's a hack, you may be
Mhm.
responsible for that,
Right. Right.
right? So that's a whole separate area if, and which is why it's really risky in some ways on both sides for for you to have, say, customer data, that has confidential, personally identifiable information and there has to be controls on that, the sort of the
Yeah.
security controls, really important.
Yeah, that also makes a lot of sense. And I think what we're seeing is a trend where, especially if you're an AI startup, a big bank or big carrier will want to have that software live on their environment, right? So they have more controls over the like the data governance and the data residency and all these things. And so it's kind of a move away from SaaS, right, which is more cloud-based software, because there's so much sensitive data that will need to be part of the context that AI will need to have. So it needs some of that context, and it doesn't make sense to have all that PII kind of moving from one cloud to another, right? You'd rather keep it in your cloud where you know where it is, you have more controls over it. And I think we're seeing a huge trend, like in some ways backwards from, away from SaaS to more like just software that is sold to big enterprises, like in their own environment.
Exactly. Totally right. Totally right. It does seem backwards, right? But it's actually better information security that way
Yeah.
and more regulatory, less regulatory concerns that way.
Yeah. The way I describe it is like, in some ways, like AI is like it's like an employee that you bring on, right? The more
Sure.
data and more context that you feed to the employee, the better. But, if your employees are handling very sensitive data, you want them to be in controlled environments, like an office where you can, what information they have access to and where and whatnot. I know that's not the best analogy, but you certainly wouldn't want them to be working out of separate buildings with no controls and safeguards in those buildings because you have no idea what's happening as soon as that person walks out the door. And essentially that's what SaaS is, right? That data leaves your walls. A whole lot of things can be done with it. Yes, you could occasionally check for what provisions and safeguards and such your SaaS vendors have, but it's another area of vulnerability that you want to clamp down on at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I mean, again, in the older days, right? I mean, there were regulations that sort of tell institutions that they have to lock their fax, the rooms that have their fax machines in it, or their, right? There's all this
Yeah,
stuff because, right? Because of the personal information of like bank account information and everything. And you have to have these locked rooms in a bank for things like that. Okay. I mean, there's all this, right? So you just think about everything about like, what if there was just a box of personal information,
yeah,
right? You have to secure that box, the hard box of hard copy documents. It's the same thing in the technology world. And of course, we saw so much of that with COVID, and how do you actually, take that to this other environment, right?
yeah.
And it's just growing and growing, but it's the same concept and really important because the security risks are in some ways, coming up against, some of the advances because
Yeah.
the security risks do slow down some of the other things,
That's right.
all
That's
the
right.
processes. But
I think the Center of FinTech Innovation Lab, which we were all a part of, you're an amazing
yeah,
mentor to us and others. And I think we learned a lot along the way. But maybe if we take this one step at a time, what's your advice to financial institutions that want to work with new startups, natively agentic AI startups and others, right? So they're keen on testing and trying the technology. What's your advice to them in terms of how to bring them on in a way that is going to feel basically it's going to comply with regulations that exist today and new regulations that may come online because they're worried about reputational risk, they're worried about all these things we've been talking through. How can they work with startups better while still like basically making sure that all the regulations are well addressed as well?
yeah. I mean, I think, but first of all, I think financial institutions, and certainly the ones in New York, including the very large ones, they really do want to work with startups. They really do want to be ahead of the game. They don't want to be viewed as being behind the eight ball, if you will,
Hmm.
on innovation. And they really do want processes that are going to be more efficient, so I think, being open-minded about it is really the most important thing. And then sort of communicating to startups what their issues are and their questions are and their concerns are, right? Is just, expressing all of that so that the startups can understand it more and then provide from the startup side how their product and also the people can really help sort of manage this sort of regulatory question, but
Hmm.
also to work together on how can this product help whatever the information flow that's needed or the process that's
Yeah.
being improved. There are so many ways that, internally in an organization, so AI and startup companies can really improve processes within the organization. I also think, though, there needs to be an open discussion about, this is not an attempt to lay off employees
Sure. Yeah.
because you're dealing with employees in the organization, right? And I think there is a little bit of a tension there sometimes
Hmm.
that needs to be, just sort of calmed.
Makes a lot of sense, and I think that
Yeah.
guidance is very, very helpful. What about two startups that want to work with financial institutions? Maybe they're starting to kind of go through security reviews and just the whole entire cycle of work that needs to get done. What's your advice to them to make sure that they have their ducks in a row so it's easier to go through all those big hoops that you have to in order to work with a large financial institution?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, it's sort of similar on either side, but it's just understand that this is not personal. Understand that they're interested in learning, and understand that they're living in an environment where they're going to be asked questions from their regulators if they, buy your product or use your product or enter into whatever an arrangement with you. And so, and that they have to go through an extensive process, but keep at it. keep at it and also just be willing to modify, customize, and think about use cases too. And the most important thing is also think about how is your product going to help them in a way that's going to reduce their costs, add to their bottom line in one way or the other. It's either increasing income or reducing costs, right? How is it going to do that and help them in their processes or in some other way that is going to help them? Sometimes it's just internal workforce things. Sometimes it's including, it could be a, diversity and inclusion type of a product. It could be ways HR workflows. It could be lots of ways that, that an AI product should be used in a workforce, right? In insurance, it could be claims processing, right? But just customization is important too, and so being open-minded about how you can customize to their particular needs because they're unique, each one of them.
Yeah, exactly. As much as you think like banks and carriers,
They're all the same.
yeah, they're
No.
not. Very, very different. What's motivating to them, what their stack looks like, varies quite a lot. And so I think there is no like one size fits all. I think that's one thing you learn very quickly working with very large enterprises. And so
Yeah.
you need to build things that are going to help you serve the customer better, but you got to leave that last little bit so you can go and take their feedback, understand what it is, and build with that in mind. That becomes true.
Yeah. And also, they have different competitive issues, right? Even though they all look the same, they do have different, competitors,
Yeah,
right? And they have different niches. That's the way they've sort of created their competitive advantages. They have different histories in that regard, right? And it's important, to actually, and that's another thing for startups. I feel like it's the same thing that I used to tell, the associates that I mentored when I was in a law firm and also my law students that I teach, it's like, know the people that you're talking to.
Yeah,
Research what they write. It's just,
yeah.
and, know something about them. And, because a lot of relationship building is that sort of like casual thing too, building that rapport that you can work together, right?
That's
There's a
right.
big part of that.
Yeah, because like when things go sideways, which it always does at some point,
Of course.
you want to know that you can rely on people, right? Like people are gonna like go the extra mile to go and make sure that the partnership is strong, and kind of they're kind of putting their neck on the line on both sides. And so I think that's right. Like the people are a huge essential part of this, as much as we think it's just technology or the product. Yeah, I think it's funny. It's like we're on a technology podcast in some ways, but
Yeah.
we're talking about how important human connection is, right? At the end of the day.
Well, there's going to be a customer service aspect to it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like, you're selling it technology, but what if something goes wrong, right? Who do I call? And are you going to be there?
Yep.
Are you going to be there immediately when I call because I have a question or a problem or something? Right. So that's important. That's really important.
Yep. Exactly.
So they're looking for those things too, just like anything else,
Maria, this has been an incredible conversation. Really love the insights. I'm very curious how the regulatory landscape shapes up with some of this new technology, but it feels like you're very dialed in to startups that are trying to sell into this space, as well as, of course, the financial institutions that you've been close to for a long time. But really appreciate all your thoughts here.
My pleasure. Really fun.